A widow building bridges. She is building her own coffin. Cornelius Blackwood said it loud enough for the whole general store to hear. 23 people laughed that August morning in 1893. 4 months later, 17 of them would owe their lives to that coffin. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. This story begins with a woman standing alone in a cemetery, talking to a grave that could not answer back. Frost Hollow Valley sat at the bottom of the world, or at least it felt that way to anyone who had survived a winter there. The valley carved itself into the Montana territory like a wound that refused to heal, a deep gouge in the mountains that trapped cold air the way a bowl traps water. In January, temperatures at the valley floor could drop 40 degrees colder than on the ridges above. In February, the thermometer stopped working entirely because mercury freezes at 39 degrees below zero, and Frost Hollow laughed at 39 below. The locals had a saying, "If you want to die young, homestead in Frost Hollow. If you want to die fast, step outside during a blizzard." In the 14 years since the first settlers arrived, the valley had claimed 47 lives. 14 of those people died within 100 feet of their own front doors. 6 died within 50 feet. 2 died within 20. The distance between safety and death in Frost Hollow was measured in footsteps, and footsteps meant nothing when you could not see your own hand in front of your face. Gunnar Larson had died 30 feet from his cabin door. His widow stood at his grave now, 6 months after they lowered him into the frozen ground, her gray hair pulled back in a simple braid, her face carved by 50 Montana winters into something that looked like granite but felt like grief. A Norwegian elk hound sat beside her, massive and silver gray, watching her with eyes that had not left her side since the day they found Gunnar's body. The dog's name was Odin. He was 6 years old, fiercely loyal, and he understood loss the way only animals can understand it. Completely, without question, without hope of explanation. Ingrid Larson did not cry at her husband's grave. She had finished crying 3 months ago, alone in her cabin, with only Odin to hear the sounds that came from somewhere deeper than her chest. Now she simply stood and remembered. She remembered Gunnar at 22, tall and golden-haired, asking her to dance at a harvest festival in Minnesota. She remembered his laugh, which sounded like summer even in the dead of winter. She remembered his hands, calloused from work but gentle when they touched her face. She remembered 43 years of marriage, 3 children raised and grown and scattered to cities back east, and one frozen night when her husband walked 30 feet to save a horse and never walked back. They found him the next morning, curled on his side in the snow, facing the cabin, facing her. His last act had been to turn toward home. "I am going to finish what you started," Ingrid said to the grave. "I found your drawings. I know what you were planning." The wind picked up, swirling snow across the cemetery in patterns that looked almost like writing. "You always said I was the builder between us, that you were just the dreamer." She paused, her voice catching. "Well, husband, I am going to build your dream. And when I am done, no one in this valley will ever freeze 30 feet from their own door again." Odin pressed against her leg. His warmth was the only warmth in the world. The drawings had been hidden in a box beneath the floorboards of Gunnar's workshop, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. Ingrid had found them while cleaning out his things, preparing to face another winter alone, and when she unrolled the papers, she felt her heart stop. Gangbru. The word came back to her from childhood, from the valleys of Setesdal in southern Norway, where her grandfather Halvor had raised her after her parents died of consumption. Gangbru, the covered walkways that connected buildings on traditional Norwegian farms, elevated passages with peaked roofs and slatted walls that allowed people to move between house and barn and storehouse without ever stepping into the killing winter. In Setesdal, "We never walk through winter," her grandfather had told her. "We walk above it." Halvor Eriksson had been a master builder, known throughout the valley for his Gangbru that could withstand any storm. He had taught Ingrid everything he knew, not because she was a boy, but because she was the only grandchild who listened, the only one who understood that survival was not about strength, it was about design. She had not thought about Gangbru in decades. Montana was not Norway. The winters were different, the materials were different, the terrain was different. And besides, she had Gunnar. Gunnar, who was strong and fast and could run to the barn and back in any weather. Until he could not. Now she sat at the kitchen table, Odin at her feet, studying her husband's drawings by lamplight. He had sketched everything. The elevation of the passage, 3 feet above ground level, to stay above the snowdrifts. The pitch of the roof, 45 degrees to shed accumulation. The slatted walls, overlapping boards with gaps between them to allow air circulation while blocking the worst of the wind. The support posts, 8 of them, sunk 4 feet into the ground and rising 10 feet above grade. He had even written notes in the margins, in his careful schoolboy English. For my Ingrid, so she never has to walk through the killing cold. Beneath that, in smaller letters, you are stronger than you know. You have always been the builder between us. I was just the dreamer. The date on the drawings was November 1892, 1 month before he died. He had known he was sick. The cough that would not go away, the weakness he tried to hide, the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of a sentence to catch his breath. He had known the winter might take him, and he had spent his last healthy weeks drawing a gift for her. Build our bridge, min elskede, live for both of us. Ingrid pressed the papers to her chest and wept. Odin put his head in her lap and did not move until morning. The general store in Frost Hollow served as the valley's unofficial gathering place, where news was shared and gossip was refined and judgments were passed on anyone foolish enough to do something different. On the morning of August 15th, 1893, Ingrid Larson walked through its doors and became the most talked about woman in 3 counties. She had come for supplies. Lumber she would cut from her own land, but she needed nails, rope, hinges, and pine pitch for ceiling. She also needed the store's scale to weigh the coins she had saved over 4 decades of careful living. Dorothea Holloway stood behind the counter, a woman whose face seemed permanently arranged into an expression of concerned disapproval. She was 52 years old, the valley's most reliable source of information about everyone else's business, and she had been watching Ingrid since the funeral with the particular attention of someone waiting for a breakdown. Mrs. Larson, her voice dripped with sympathy. How are you managing all alone out there? I am managing fine, Dorothea. I need 20 pounds of nails, 50 feet of rope, and as much pine pitch as you have. Dorothea's eyebrows rose. That is a lot of supplies for a widow. I am building something. The store had gone quiet. 8 people had stopped their conversations to listen. Ingrid could feel their attention like heat on her skin, but she did not turn around. Building what, dear? A passage, a covered walkway between my cabin and my workshop, elevated with a roof and walls, like they build in Norway. The silence stretched. Then someone laughed, then someone else. Then the whole store was laughing, and Ingrid stood at the counter with her coins in her hand and her spine straight as a lodgepole pine. Cornelius Blackwood pushed his way to the front. He was 58 years old, the wealthiest rancher in Frost Hollow, owner of 2,000 acres and 300 head of cattle, and he had tried to buy Ingrid's land 3 times since Gunnar's funeral. Each time she had refused. Each time his offers had become less generous and more threatening. A widow building bridges, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. She is building her own coffin. More laughter. Cornelius smiled the smile of a man who was used to being agreed with. Mrs. Larson, he continued, stepping closer, you have 80 acres of prime land with water rights to Coal Creek. That land is worth something. Your husband's death was tragic, but it should have taught you something. This valley is no place for a woman alone. Sell to me, I will give you a fair price. You can move somewhere warm, live out your days in comfort. Ingrid met his eyes. She had known Cornelius for 20 years, had watched him accumulate land and power with the patience of a glacier grinding down a mountain. She knew what he really wanted, the creek, the water, control over every drop that flowed through the valley. My grandfather built Gangbru in Norway, she said quietly, covered passages that connected every building on the farm. 80 years, Mr. Blackwood. 80 years with those passages, and not one member of my family ever froze to death walking between buildings. Not one. Your grandfather is not here, neither is your husband, and Norwegian superstition will not keep you warm when January comes. No, Ingrid agreed. Good design will keep me warm, and when January comes, and the rest of you are burning through your wood just to keep from freezing, I will be walking between my buildings in my shirt sleeves. Cornelius stared at her. Then he laughed again, but this time there was something sharp in it. I will make you one more offer, Mrs. Larson, $500 for your land. That is more than fair. $500. It was more money than most families in the valley earned in 5 years. It was enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere easier, somewhere that did not kill people 30 feet from their own doors. Ingrid thought about Gunnar's drawings hidden beneath her floorboards. She thought about her grandfather's voice, patient and kind, teaching her the angles that made roofs shed snow. She thought about 43 years of marriage and one frozen body facing home. No. The word fell like a stone into still water. Cornelius's face hardened. You will regret that, Mrs. Larson. This valley will kill you before spring. Ingrid picked up her supplies and turned to leave. At the door, she paused. In Norway, we have a saying, Mr. Blackwood. The bridge answers the doubter. She met his eyes one final time. You will see. Before we continue, I want to pause and ask you something. Ingrid Larson was 50 years old, recently widowed, and about to attempt something that every person in her community thought was impossible. She had knowledge from her grandfather, drawings from her husband, and absolutely no one who believed in her. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Have you ever known something was right, felt it in your bones, even when everyone around you said you were foolish? Take a moment to think about that. And if you are enjoying this story, please take a second to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this one. Now let us see what happened when Ingrid started building. September in Frost Hollow was a beautiful liar. The aspens turned gold, the sky stretched blue from horizon to horizon, and the air carried just enough chill to remind you that winter was coming, while still letting you believe you had time to prepare. It was the valley's way of lulling you into complacency before it tried to kill you. Ingrid did not have time for complacency. She began on September 3rd, alone except for Odin, who appointed himself supervisor of all operations. The dog would sit on the cabin porch for hours, watching her work, occasionally barking when she did something he disapproved of. She never figured out what criteria he used for disapproval, but she appreciated the company. The first task was the posts. 8 of them, Douglas fir, 18 inches in diameter, sunk 4 feet into the ground. Digging post holes in Montana soil was like trying to dig through concrete mixed with boulders. Every shovelful was a negotiation between woman and earth, and the earth was not inclined to cooperate. She worked from dawn until dark, breaking only to eat and to talk to Odin. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her back screamed, then quieted into a dull ache that became her constant companion. Her muscles, softened by years of domestic work, remembered what they had known in Norway and grew hard again. By the end of the first week, she had 2 holes dug. You are building yourself a grave, Mrs. Larson. The voice came from behind her. She turned to find Cornelius Blackwood sitting on a horse at the edge of her property, watching her with an expression that mixed amusement with contempt. I wondered how long it would take you to come back, Ingrid said. She did not stop digging. I came to give you one more chance. $400. Final offer. Still no. Cornelius shook his head. You know what happened to my wife, Mrs. Larson? My daughter? Ingrid paused. She had heard rumors, fragments of a tragedy that happened before she and Gunnar arrived in the valley. 20 years ago, Christmas Eve, Elizabeth and our daughter Mary wanted to check on a sick calf in the barn, 60 feet from our door to the barn door. The storm came up fast. Cornelius's voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were reading from a newspaper. I watched them from the window, watched them try to find their way back, watched them fall. I could not reach them. The wind was too strong. They froze to death 60 feet from our house while I stood at the window and watched. Ingrid said nothing. There was nothing to say. So you see, Mrs. Larson, I know what this valley can do. I know that no wooden walkway is going to stop it. The only protection is money. Enough money to leave when the storms come. Enough money to hire men to do the dangerous work. Enough money to insulate yourself from the cold. Or, Ingrid said quietly, enough design to make the dangerous work unnecessary. Cornelius stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, a sound without joy. Build your coffin, Mrs. Larson. When you freeze to death in it, I will buy your land from the bank, and I will tear that Norwegian nonsense down board by board. He rode away without looking back. Odin growled at his retreating figure until he disappeared over the ridge. Word spread through Frost Hollow the way all words spread in small communities, quickly, inaccurately, and with considerable embellishment. By the end of September, every person in the valley had an opinion about the widow Larson and her peculiar construction project. Dr. Franklin Mercer, the valley's only physician and its most educated citizen, rode out to inspect the progress after the fourth post went up. He was 45 years old, Harvard-trained, and absolutely certain of his own intelligence. "Mrs. Larson," he said, circling the post with his hands clasped behind his back, "I feel obligated to inform you that what you are attempting is structurally impossible." Ingrid did not look up from the hole she was digging. "Is that so? The cantilever stress alone would collapse any wooden structure of this span. The horizontal beams you are proposing would need to support, not only their own weight, but also the weight of any snow accumulation, plus the dynamic loads from wind shear. I have a degree from Harvard, Mrs. Larson. The physics simply do not support your design." "And yet," Ingrid said, still digging, "my grandfather built 14 of these structures in Norway, and they lasted 80 years. Norway is not Montana. Cold is cold, Dr. Mercer. Snow is snow, and physics does not change depending on which country you are standing in." Dr. Mercer sputtered, "I am trying to help you, Mrs. Larson. When this structure collapses, and it will collapse, you could be killed. Or worse, someone else could be killed. I strongly advise you to abandon this project before you waste any more resources." Ingrid finally looked up. "Thank you for your concern, Doctor. You will see." She went back to digging. Dr. Mercer rode away, muttering about stubborn immigrants. The Reverend Josiah Whitfield came next, on a Sunday afternoon when Ingrid was fitting the first horizontal beam between posts 1 and 2. He was 55, stern-faced, and deeply suspicious of anything that originated outside the Protestant traditions of New England. "Mrs. Larson," he said, not dismounting from his horse, "I have heard disturbing reports about what you are building here. It is called a Gangbru, Reverend, a covered passage. My grandfather built them in Norway." "Yes, Norway." The Reverend's voice made the word sound like a disease. "I have read about Norwegian traditions, Mrs. Larson. Folk beliefs, pagan superstitions barely covered by a thin veneer of Christianity. I must ask, is this structure based on such beliefs?" "It is based on geometry, Reverend. Angles and measurements. The same principles that built the churches of Europe." Reverend Whitfield's eyes narrowed. "Norwegian folk wisdom is dangerously close to paganism, Mrs. Larson. Perhaps grief has clouded your judgment. Perhaps you should spend more time in prayer and less time on this construction." Ingrid set down her tools. "Reverend, my husband died 30 feet from our door." 30 feet. If I had built this passage years ago, he would still be alive." She paused, letting the words settle. "Now you can tell me that God's will is mysterious. You can tell me that we are not meant to understand his plan. But I believe God gave us minds so we could solve problems. And I intend to use mine." The Reverend opened his mouth, then closed it. He was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by widows. "I will pray for you, Mrs. Larson," he finally said. "I will pray that you see the error of your ways before it is too late." He rode away. Ingrid picked up her tools and went back to work. The skeptics kept coming. Dorothea Holloway brought 2 friends from the Ladies' Aid Society to observe what she called the poor widow's breakdown. They stood at the edge of the property, clucking sympathetically, until Odin chased them off with a display of teeth that made their horses bolt. Ezekiel Tanner, a 22-year-old ranch hand known throughout the valley for his gambling and his loud opinions, arrived with a group of young men to make a formal wager. $20 says it falls before Christmas," he announced, waving a handful of bills. "Who wants to bet against the Norwegian Coffin?" Several hands reached for the money. Within an hour, $200 had been wagered on the exact date of the structure's collapse. Silas Patterson, Ingrid's nearest neighbor, came not to mock but to warn. He was 48 years old, practical to the point of grimness, and he had survived 30 winters in Frost Hollow through careful planning and absolute refusal to take unnecessary risks. "I have been here 30 years, Mrs. Larson," he said, standing beside one of the posts and testing its solidity with his hand. "Nobody needs a covered bridge between buildings. It has never been done. That does not mean it cannot be done. It does not mean it should be done either." Silas shook his head. You are going to fail, and when you do, the whole valley is going to laugh at you. Worse, you are going to give them reason to dismiss any woman who tries to do anything different. Maybe, Ingrid said. Or maybe I am going to succeed and give them reason to try something different themselves. Silas left without another word, but his daughter did not. Linnea Patterson was 17 years old with her father's practical nature and her late mother's curious mind. She had watched the construction from a distance for weeks, fascinated by the strange structure taking shape on the Larson property. Finally, on the day after her father's visit, she appeared at the edge of the worksite with a basket of food and 1,000 questions. "Mrs. Larson," she said, her voice carrying the careful politeness of a young woman raised to respect her elders, "I thought you might be hungry." Ingrid looked up from the beam she was notching. The girl was tall, blonde, with intelligent eyes that reminded her of someone. Herself, perhaps, at that age. "That is kind of you, Linnea. Set it on the porch." But instead of leaving, Linnea stayed. She watched Ingrid work for nearly an hour, asking questions that revealed a mind hungry for understanding. Why do the walls have gaps? To let the air through while blocking the snow. If I made them solid, moisture would build up inside and rot the wood. Why is the floor so high off the ground? To stay above the snow drifts. Most drifts in this valley pile 2 or 3 feet high. My passage sits at 3 feet, so even in a heavy snow I can walk across without waiting. Why does the roof angle so steeply? So the snow slides off instead of building up. The steeper the pitch, the faster the shed, the less weight on the structure. With each answer, Linnea's eyes grew wider. She was seeing something she had never seen before. Knowledge that came not from books, but from generations of survival, passed down through families who had learned to live in places that wanted them dead. "My father says this is foolishness," she said finally, "but it does not look foolish to me. It looks like the smartest thing I have ever seen." Ingrid smiled for the first time in weeks. "Would you like to learn how to notch a beam?" Linnea looked over her shoulder toward her father's property, toward the life where women cooked and cleaned and did not build things. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." The friendship that developed between the 50-year-old widow and the 17-year-old girl was not expected by anyone, least of all by Silas Patterson. When he discovered that his daughter had been spending her afternoons at the Larson homestead, learning to measure angles and cut joints, he reacted as fathers often react to things they do not understand. He forbade it. "You are making us a laughingstock," he told Linnea at dinner, his voice tight with anger. "That Norwegian woman is out of her mind, and you are encouraging her. She is not out of her mind, Father. She is brilliant. The things she knows about building, about design, about how to make structures that can survive anything." "Enough," Silas slammed his hand on the table. "You will not go back there. You will not speak to her. You will not have anything to do with that foolish project. Do you understand?" Linnea understood. She understood that her father was afraid, not of Ingrid, but of change. Afraid that his daughter might become something he did not recognize. Afraid that the world might shift beneath his feet if women started building bridges. She said yes to his face and went back to the Larson homestead the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that, and every afternoon for the next 6 weeks. Some lessons are more important than obedience. October came, and with it the first real test. The passage was not yet complete, just a skeleton of posts and beams in the beginning of a floor, but it was enough to show that the structure would stand. The posts had not shifted, the beams had not cracked. The joints, carefully notched and fitted, held firm against the early autumn winds. Old Sven Lindqvist arrived on October 10th, drawn by curiosity and a rumor that would not die. He was 72 years old, Swedish by birth, and he had not spoken more than a dozen words to anyone in Frost Hollow since his wife died 8 years ago. He stood at the edge of the construction site for a long time, his ancient eyes moving over every joint, every angle, every carefully considered detail. Then he walked closer, running his weathered hands over the posts, testing the beams with his weight. "Gangbru," he said finally, the first word Ingrid had ever heard him speak. His voice was rusty from disuse, but the word was clear. "My grandmother had one in Uppsala. I thought the knowledge was lost." Ingrid climbed down from the framework where she had been fitting rafters. "You recognize it?" "I recognize the principles. The elevation, the pitch of the roof, the spacing of the louvers." He shook his head slowly. I have not seen work like this in 50 years. My grandfather taught me. In Sedistal. Sven nodded. The old ways. They knew things we have forgotten. He looked at her with something like respect. Your posts are good, but the angle on number 3 is off by 2 degrees. It will hold, but it will hold better if you correct it. Ingrid looked at the post he indicated. She had checked it a dozen times, but she checked again, and he was right. 2 degrees off, true. How did you know? Sven almost smiled. I have been looking at posts for 70 years. Some things you learn to see. He helped her correct the angle, and then he stayed for dinner, and then he came back the next day, and the day after that. He did not say much, but his presence said everything. Someone else understood. Someone else believed it was enough. The passage was finished on October 15th, 1893. Ingrid stood at one end in the doorway of her main cabin, looking down the length of her creation. 30 feet of covered walkway, 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall, elevated 3 feet above the ground on 8 solid posts. The roof peaked at 45 degrees, covered with overlapping boards sealed with pine pitch. The walls were made of horizontal slats, overlapping by 2 inches, with 1-inch gaps between them to allow air circulation while blocking the worst of wind and snow. It was not beautiful. It was not elegant. It was practical, functional, and built to survive anything the Montana winter could throw at it. Gunner, she whispered. I finished it. Your bridge. Our bridge. Odin stood beside her, tail wagging slowly. He had watched every nail driven, every beam fitted, every shingle laid. Now he seemed to understand that something important had been completed. Ingrid took a deep breath and stepped onto the passage floor. Her boots made solid sounds on the boards, sounds of stability and permanence. She walked the full 30 feet to her workshop door, then turned and walked back. The wind was blowing outside, a cold October wind that carried the promise of worse to come. But inside the passage, she felt nothing. The slatted walls broke the force of the gusts, letting air through without letting the cold cut into her. The roof overhead blocked the occasional spatter of rain. The floor beneath her feet was solid and dry. She walked back and forth a dozen times, testing, feeling, understanding. Then she sat down in the middle of the passage, her back against one wall, and she cried. Not from sadness this time, from relief, from pride, from the knowledge that she had done something everyone said was impossible, and it worked. Odin came to sit beside her. He put his massive head in her lap and let her tears fall into his fur. We did it, boy, she said. We actually did it. Odin's tail thumped against the floor. Of course they did. Had there ever been doubt? The first storm came 2 weeks later, on October 29th. It was not a major storm, not by Frost Hollow standards. 18 inches of snow, winds gusting to 40 miles per hour, temperatures dropping to 10 below zero. A normal late October storm, the kind that reminded everyone what was coming. Ingrid spent the night in her cabin, listening to the wind howl outside her windows, and in the morning she opened the door that connected to her passage. The floor was dry, completely dry. The elevated design had worked exactly as planned, keeping the walking surface above the snow that had drifted against the posts. The peaked roof had shed every flake, leaving only a light dusting on the boards that blew away in the morning breeze. She stepped onto the passage and walked its length in her house shoes. The temperature inside the passage was not warm exactly, but it was dramatically different from outside. She estimated 15 degrees warmer, maybe more. The slatted walls blocked the wind completely while still allowing air to circulate, preventing the moisture buildup that would rot the wood. The design that her grandfather had perfected in Norway worked just as well in Montana. She reached her workshop, opened the door, and stepped inside to start her day's work. She had not felt a single snowflake. She had not felt a single gust of wind. She had walked 30 feet through a Montana winter morning without putting on a coat. Gunner's Bridge answered the doubters. Word spread quickly. By noon, half a dozen people had ridden out to see the structure that everyone had said would fail. They stood at the edge of the property, staring at the elevated passage with its dry floor and shed roof, unable to believe what they were seeing. It is still standing, Carl Jensen said, wonder in his voice. After that storm, it is still standing. Lucky, Cornelius Blackwood said. He had come with the others, unable to stay away. One storm proves nothing. Wait until a real blizzard. But his voice lacked conviction. He had seen the same thing everyone else had seen. A widow's impossible dream, standing solid in the morning light. Silas Patterson came too, and when he saw his daughter standing beside Ingrid, helping her clear the last of the snow from the roof, his face went through several complicated expressions before settling on something that might have been grudging respect. It is still standing, he admitted. I will give her that. Linnea smiled at her father. It is not just standing, father. It is working. Mrs. Larson walked from her cabin to her workshop this morning without a coat. Silas stared at her, then at the passage, then at Ingrid. He did not say anything else, but he did not forbid Linnea from returning either. Some lessons take longer to learn than others. November brought colder weather, and with it, another discovery. Ingrid was cleaning her workshop when she found the box. It had been hidden behind a stack of lumber, pushed into a corner where she had not thought to look during those first grief-stricken months. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Letters Gunnar had written but never sent, addressed to her, dated over the last year of his life. She read them all that night, by lamplight, with Odin pressed against her feet. Letters about his hopes for the homestead. Letters about his fears for the future. Letters about his love for her, expressed in the simple words of a simple man who had never learned to be eloquent, but had learned to be true. And one letter dated November 1892, that changed everything. My dearest Ingrid, it began, I know this winter may be my last. The cough grows worse each day, and I feel the cold settling into my bones in a way that will not leave. Dr. Mercer says it is nothing, but I know my own body, and I know when it is preparing to give up. I have drawn the Gangbru because I believe you will build it when I cannot. You have always been the builder between us. I could dream the dreams, but you were the one who knew how to make them real. Every good thing we have built together, you're the foundation. Do not let them tell you it is impossible. Do not let them tell you that a woman cannot do what needs to be done. You are stronger than any of them, stronger than you know, and the knowledge your grandfather gave you is worth more than all their education. Build our bridge, Min Elskade. Live for both of us. And when the storms come, walk through them in your shirt sleeves and know that I am walking beside you. Your husband, forever and always. Gunnar. Ingrid pressed the letter to her heart and wept. Not from sadness this time, from love that survived death, from the knowledge that even in his final days, Gunnar had believed in her. She had thought she was finishing his dream. Now she understood that he had always known it was her dream too. And now we come to the turning point of our story. December arrived, and with it, the warnings. Old Sven Lindqvist felt it first. He had survived 72 winters, and his bones had learned to read the weather the way some people read books. Something is coming, he told Ingrid on December 14th. Something bad. The pressure is wrong. The animals are wrong. I have felt this twice before in my life, and both times people died. When? Soon. Days, maybe less. He looked at the sky, which had turned a sickly yellow-gray. Get ready, Mrs. Larson. Whatever you think you have prepared for, prepare for more. Ingrid spent the next 3 days stockpiling. Firewood in both cabins, food in both cabins, water in both cabins, blankets, medical supplies, everything she could think of that might be needed if the worst came. She did not know that 17 people would soon need those supplies. She did not know that the worst storm in 3 years was about to descend on Frost Hollow Valley. She did not know that December 17th, 1893 would become a date that survivors would speak of for the rest of their lives. All she knew was that something was coming, and her bridge was ready. If you are still with me, I want you to know that the story we have told so far is just the beginning. What happens next is the reason I wanted to share this story with you. It is about courage and compassion, and what happens when the person everyone called a fool turns out to be the only one who can save them. Before we continue, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button if you have not already. And if this story is touching you, leave a comment below. I read every single one. Now let us see what happened when the storm arrived. December 17th, 1893. 3 years to the day since the Great White Death had swept across Montana Territory, killing 23 people in a single night. The old Tickners still talked about that storm in hushed voices, the way people talk about things too terrible to fully remember but too important to ever forget. They had buried the dead in the spring when the ground thawed enough for shovels, and they had promised themselves that they would be better prepared if it ever happened again. They were not prepared. The storm announced itself at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with a pressure drop so sudden that horses screamed and dogs howled and people grabbed their heads as if struck by invisible hands. Within an hour, the sky had gone from yellow-gray to black. Within 2 hours, visibility dropped to zero. Within 3 hours, the temperature had fallen 40 degrees and was still falling. Ingrid was in her workshop when the first winds hit. She heard them before she felt them. A sound like all the trains in the world arriving at once. A roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Then the building shuddered and snow began to drive against the windows with a force that sounded like gravel thrown by giants. Odin pressed against her legs, whimpering. He was not a dog that frightened easily, but this storm was different. This storm meant to kill. Ingrid looked at the door connecting her workshop to the passage. Through the small window, she could see nothing but white chaos, snow moving horizontally at speeds that would strip flesh from bone. She opened the door. The passage walls shuddered with each gust, but they held. Snow pressed against the slatted sides, filling the gaps in places, but the overlapping boards blocked the bulk of it. The floor was dry. The air was cold, bitter cold, but still, the passage had become a tunnel through hell. Ingrid walked to her main cabin without difficulty. Odin trotted beside her, his tail low but his feet steady. Inside the cabin, she stoked the fire, checked her supplies, and settled in to wait. She did not know that across the valley, roofs were beginning to collapse. She did not know that Silas Patterson was trapped under a fallen beam, his leg broken, his family screaming. She did not know that within hours, people who had laughed at her would be pounding on her door, begging for shelter. The storm had only just begun. The first day was the worst. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped to 35 below zero. The wind chill, if anyone had been able to measure it, would have registered somewhere around 70 below. Exposed skin would freeze in less than a minute. Lungs could be damaged by breathing the air too quickly. Ingrid sat by her fire, listening to the storm rage outside, and thought about the people of Frost Hollow. The Hendricks family with their drafty boarding house. Old Sven in his small cabin on the northern ridge. The Pattersons with their inadequate roof. Cornelius Blackwood with his big house and his bigger pride. She wondered how many of them would survive. She did not have to wonder long. The pounding came at 11 o'clock at night. Ingrid had been dozing in her chair. Odin curled at her feet when the sound jerked her awake. Not the pounding of the wind, which had become a constant roar. Something different, something human. She grabbed her lantern and went to the front door. Through the small window, she could see nothing but white. The pounding came again, weaker this time. She opened the door. Linnea Patterson collapsed into her arms. The girl was barely recognizable. Her face was white with frost, her lips blue, her eyes wild with terror. She was shaking so violently that she could not speak, could only gesture back toward the white chaos she had emerged from. Ingrid pulled her inside, wrapped her in blankets, sat her by the fire. Odin pressed against the girl's legs, offering warmth. Slowly, too slowly, Linnea stopped shaking. Our roof, she finally managed, collapsed. Father is trapped. His leg is broken. Mother and the children are there, but we have no heat. The chimney is blocked. We will freeze. How many? 7. 7 of us. Please, Mrs. Larson, we have nowhere. Ingrid did not hesitate. Bring them all. Through the front door. Quickly. She pressed a rope into Linnea's hands, one end tied to her doorpost, and watched the girl disappear back into the storm. The rope stretched taut. Ingrid held her breath. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. Then shapes emerged from the white. Helena Patterson, Silas's wife, carrying an infant. 2 older children clinging to her skirts. A teenage boy half carrying his father, whose face was gray with pain. And Linnea bringing up the rear, her hand on the rope like it was the only thing keeping her connected to the world. 7 people crowded into Ingrid's cabin, which had been sized for 1 woman and 1 dog. Silas Patterson looked at her, his eyes glazed with pain and shame. I called you a fool, Mrs. Larson. I forbade my daughter from helping you. You are inside now, Ingrid said. That is what matters. She looked at the assembled family, at the cabin that was already too small, at the fire that would burn through its wood too quickly with this many people. The workshop, she said. We can fit more people there. It has a forge. Follow me, Guami. She led them through the passage. Helena Patterson stared as she walked, unable to believe what she was experiencing. A calm corridor through a killing storm, protected movement through chaos, warmth where there should have been death. How is this possible, she whispered. My grandfather built them in Norway, Ingrid said. He called them Gangbru, bridges through winter. They reached the workshop, which was smaller than the cabin but warmer because of the forge Ingrid used for metalwork. She had kept it banked but ready, and within minutes she had it roaring, filling the space with heat. The children stopped shivering. The infant stopped crying. Silas Patterson, his legs splinted with boards and rope, looked at the woman he had dismissed as foolish and found he could not speak. You saved us, Helena said, her voice breaking. Mrs. Larson, you saved my whole family. I just built a passage, Ingrid said. My husband drew the plans. My grandfather taught me the skills. I only put them together. But Helena was not listening to false modesty. She was looking at the passage door, at the dry floor, at the walls that held back the storm. You did not just build a passage, she said. You built a miracle. The second day brought more refugees. They came in pairs and groups, stumbling through the storm, guided by rumor and desperation, and the faint hope that the Norwegian widow's impossible construction might actually be real. The Hendricks family arrived at dawn, 4 people from the boarding house whose roof had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. The father had frostbitten fingers. The mother was in shock. The 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, were silent with terror. Ingrid put them in the main cabin with blankets and hot broth and orders to stay by the fire. Old Sven Lindqvist appeared at noon, having crawled from his cabin to his barn, and then somehow impossibly made his way across 2 miles of killing cold to Ingrid's property. His lips were black with frost. His hands were claws, but his eyes were clear. I knew it would work, he said as Ingrid pulled him inside. I knew the Gangbru would hold. She put him in the workshop, near the forge where the heat was strongest, and she did not leave his side until the color returned to his face. Klaus Weber came in the afternoon, the German blacksmith from the edge of town, dragging a sled with his wife and 2 children, bundled in every blanket they owned. His own forge had exploded when a chimney cracked in the cold, filling his workshop with smoke. They had fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. I did not know where else to go, he said, his voice heavy with shame. They said your building was standing. They said you had room. There is always room, Ingrid said, always room for those who need it. By nightfall of the second day, 15 people were sheltering in Ingrid's 2 cabins and the passage between them. They slept in shifts, ate carefully rationed food, burned wood from Ingrid's ample supply, and waited for the storm to break. It did not break. The 3rd day was when Ingrid almost died. The wood supply in the main cabin was running low. The workshop forge had enough fuel for another day, maybe 2, but the cabin fireplace was eating through logs at an alarming rate. 15 people generated heat, yes, but they also required heat, and the fire was the only thing standing between them and the cold that waited outside. The woodpile was 15 feet from the passage, 15 feet of open ground, 15 feet of storm. I will go, Silas Patterson said, trying to rise on his broken leg. You cannot walk, Ingrid said. Then send one of the boys. I will not send a child into that. I will go. This from Klaus Weber. Let me go. Ingrid looked at him, at his frostbitten ears and his exhausted eyes, and his wife who had not stopped crying since they arrived. No, she said, this is my home, my responsibility. She tied a rope around her waist, knotted the other end to the doorpost, and stepped into the white chaos. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and the sight from her eyes. She could not see the woodpile. She could not see her own feet. She could only feel the rope behind her and the direction she needed to go. 1 step, 2, 3. The wind knocked her down on the 7th step. She fell hard, the snow immediately beginning to cover her, and for a moment she could not remember which way was up. The rope tugged at her waist, but even that orientation meant nothing in the white void. She could have been falling through clouds. She could have been drowning in milk. Then she heard the barking. Odin had followed her through the door. Odin, who had watched over her for 6 months, who had never left her side since Gunnar died, was standing somewhere in the storm, barking with all his strength. She crawled toward the sound. The barking guided her to the woodpile, a mountain of split logs covered in snow but still accessible. She loaded her arms with as much as she could carry. She could not feel her fingers. She could not feel her face, but she could still hear the dog. She followed the barking back to the door. Hands grabbed her and pulled her inside. Someone took the wood from her arms. Someone wrapped her in blankets. Someone put hot water to her lips. And Odin pressed against her, his warmth seeping into her frozen body, his tongue licking her frostbitten cheeks. "You are a fool," Helena Patterson said, but there were tears in her eyes. A brave, stupid fool. The wood was enough for another day. And now I want to pause again, because what happened next is the most extraordinary part of this story. On the fourth day of the storm, with 15 people already sheltering in Ingrid's cabins, someone else came to the door. Someone no one expected. Someone who had done everything in his power to make Ingrid fail. Do you know who I am talking about? Stay with me. The ending of this story is worth the wait. And if you are watching on YouTube, please take a moment to like this video. It really does help other people find these stories. Now let us continue. The fourth day. The storm had been raging for 72 hours. The valley was buried under snow that drifted 15 feet high in places. Trees had snapped like matchsticks. Buildings had collapsed. Livestock had frozen where they stood. And still the wind howled. Ingrid was in the passage, checking the walls for damage, when she heard the sound. Not the pounding of someone at the door. Something weaker. Something almost like scratching. She went to the cabin door and looked through the small window. A figure stood in the white, barely visible, swaying, not walking toward the door, just standing. Swaying, she opened the door. Cornelius Blackwood fell forward into her arms. The richest man in Frost Hollow was almost unrecognizable. His face was gray with cold, his expensive clothes torn and ice-crusted, his hands black with frostbite. He was trying to speak, but no words came out, only a sound like wind through dead leaves. Ingrid dragged him inside. In the warmth of the cabin, surrounded by people who had every reason to hate him, Cornelius Blackwood began to weep. "My barn," he finally managed, "collapsed. All my cattle, dead. My house, the chimney cracked. Smoke, could not breathe." He looked at Ingrid with eyes that held no pride, no arrogance, nothing but animal terror. "I had nowhere else." Nowhere. Ingrid stared at him. This was the man who had called her dream a coffin. The man who had tried to take her land. The man who had sent people to sabotage her construction. The man who had made bets on her failure. This was the man who had watched his wife and daughter freeze to death 20 years ago and had spent every day since trying to accumulate enough power to feel safe. She thought about Gunnar, frozen 30 feet from their door. She thought about the letter he had written, telling her she was stronger than she knew. She thought about 17 people in her cabins, alive because she had believed in something everyone said was impossible. "Come in, Mr. Blackwood," she said. "No one freezes to death at my doorstep. Not even you." Cornelius stared at her. "I called you a fool," he whispered. "I tried to take your land. I told everyone you would fail." "Yes," Ingrid said. "You did. Why are you helping me?" Ingrid looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the passage door, at the walls that held back the storm, at the bridge her husband had dreamed and she had built. "Because this is what the bridge is for," she said. "Not just for me, for everyone." She paused. "My husband taught me that love is not something you hoard. It is something you build. And once you build it, you have to let everyone walk across." She stepped aside to let him in. Cornelius Blackwood walked into the warmth, and for the first time in 20 years, he let himself be saved by something other than money. The fifth day. 17 people sheltered in Ingrid's cabins. 17 people who had laughed at her, doubted her, forbidden their children from helping her. 17 people who owed their lives to a widow's impossible dream. They had organized themselves over the days. Women and children in the main cabin, men in the workshop. The passage served as common ground, a place where meals were shared and stories were told and the impossible became ordinary. Odin circulated among them like a furry ambassador, accepting treats, offering comfort, letting the children bury their faces in his warm fur when they cried. The Hendricks girl, Emma, had not spoken since she arrived, traumatized by the terror of the storm. But on the fourth day, she sat beside Odin and whispered something in his ear. And on the fifth day, she asked if she could help feed him. It was the first complete sentence she had spoken since her world collapsed. The sixth day. The storm broke on December 22nd, 1893. Ingrid was the first one out. She walked through the passage, descended the stairs at the workshop inn, and stepped into a transformed world. The valley was buried. Snow had drifted so high that first-floor windows had disappeared. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by white mounds and strange shapes. Trees that had stood for 100 years were snapped or bent. Buildings that had housed families were collapsed into rubble. Her passage stood. The peaked roof had shed the snow exactly as designed. The elevated floor sat above the worst drifts. The slatted walls had flexed with the wind instead of fighting it. The posts her grandfather had taught her to set. The beams her husband had helped her envision. The structure that everyone had called impossible had survived the worst storm in 3 years. Dear God. Silas Patterson stood behind her, supported by Klaus Weber, staring at what remained of the valley. Mrs. Larson, his voice was barely audible. Your design, it actually worked. I told you it would. You told me. I did not believe you. He turned to face her, his eyes bright with tears. No one believed you, and you saved us anyway. Behind him, 17 people emerged from the cabins, blinking in the sudden brightness, staring at the devastation in the one structure that had survived it. They had gone in as skeptics. They came out as believers. The full cost of the storm became clear over the following days. 11 people had died in Frost Hollow Valley. 11 souls who could not reach shelter, could not find protection, could not survive the 5 days of killing. Cold, the Hendricks hired man caught in his cabin when the roof collapsed. A young couple from the eastern ridge, frozen halfway between their home and their barn. An elderly woman who had lived alone, found in her bed where the cold had taken her quietly in her sleep. And 7 others, scattered across the valley, each death a story of inches and seconds and terrible luck. 17 people had lived because of Ingrid's passage. 17 people who would have died if a widow had listened to the doubters. The day after the storm, Cornelius Blackwood asked to speak with Ingrid alone. They stood in the passage, the structure that had saved his life, surrounded by the walls he had called a coffin. 20 years ago, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I watched my wife and daughter freeze to death 60 feet from our door. I could see them through the window. I could see Elizabeth holding Mary, trying to keep her warm. I could see them fall, and I could not reach them. The wind was too strong. Ingrid said nothing. Some stories needed to be told without interruption. I spent 20 years believing that the only protection was money, Cornelius continued. Enough money to hire men to do the dangerous work. Enough money to leave when the storms came. Enough money to never be helpless again. He looked at her. I was wrong. We all believe things that are wrong, Ingrid said. The important thing is what we do when we learn the truth. Cornelius nodded slowly. Teach me, he met her eyes. Teach me how to build what you have built. I will pay for materials for every family in this valley to have a passage like yours. I do not need your money, Mr. Blackwood. Then what do you need? Your hands. She looked at the passage around them. Help me teach others. That is enough. Cornelius was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. Where do we start? Dr. Franklin Mercer came to see Ingrid 2 days after the storm. He had lost 3 patients during the blizzard. Not to the cold directly, but to injuries sustained when buildings collapsed, to infections that set in because he could not reach them through the storm, to complications that might have been treated if he had been able to get through. He stood in the passage, running his hands over the walls, testing the floor with his feet, examining every detail with the intensity of a man whose certainties had been shattered. I told you the physics were impossible, he said finally. The cantilever stress, the wind shear, the dynamic loads. He shook his head. I was wrong, not about the physics, about the application. Your grandfather understood something that my textbooks never taught. That structures can flex instead of resist. That gaps can be stronger than solid walls. That elevation changes everything. Does this mean you are apologizing, Doctor? Dr. Mercer almost smiled. This means I am asking you to teach me. I have a degree from Harvard, Mrs. Larson. It appears I have much more to learn. The spring of 1894 brought transformation to Frost Hollow Valley. Ingrid spent the warming months teaching. Anyone who wanted to learn was welcome. 9 families built passages that spring, each one adapted to their particular needs. Some connected house to barn, some connected house to workshop. The Pattersons built a complex system connecting 4 buildings in a square formation, creating a protected courtyard where children could play even in the worst weather. Linnea Patterson became Ingrid's official apprentice, the first woman in the valley to be recognized as a builder in her own right. Her father, humbled by the storm that had broken his leg and saved his life, did not object. Some lessons take catastrophe to teach. Old Sven Lindqvist contributed his knowledge of Swedish construction techniques, adding refinements that made the passages even stronger. Klaus Weber forged the hardware, hinges and brackets, and hardware that would last for decades. And Cornelius Blackwood kept his promise. He paid for materials for 12 families who could not afford their own. He worked alongside them, driving nails and carrying beams, learning skills that his money had always allowed him to avoid. He never apologized with words for what he had done to Ingrid, but he apologized with actions every day for the rest of his life. The design that had been called Norwegian nonsense, that had been bet against and mocked and sabotaged, became the standard for survival in Frost Hollow. Within 5 years, every family in the valley had at least one passage. Within 10 years, the design had spread to neighboring valleys. Within 20 years, they were calling them Larson passages, and builders were coming from as far as Canada and Alaska to learn the techniques. Ingrid protested the name. She said the design belonged to her grandfather, to generations of Norwegian farmers who had learned to walk above winter. But the name stuck anyway because history remembers the people who build things, not just the people who dream them. Before we finish this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a position where you had to choose between protecting yourself and helping someone who had hurt you? Ingrid had every reason to leave Cornelius Blackwood in the snow. He had tried to take her land. He had called her a fool. He had done everything he could to make her fail. But she opened her door anyway. I think that is what makes this story special. Not the building, not the survival, but the choice to save even those who did not deserve saving. If this story has touched you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it, and leave a comment below telling me what you think. I read every single one, Beppo. Now let us see how this story ends. When the last of the refugees left Ingrid's cabin, they did not simply walk away. Each one stopped at the door, turned back, and looked at the woman who had saved their lives. Helena Patterson embraced her, weeping. The Hendricks children, who had arrived silent with terror, left singing a song that Ingrid had taught them during the long nights. Old Sven kissed her hand in the European way, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Even Cornelius Blackwood paused at the threshold, unable to speak, unable to express what he felt, but his face said everything his words could not. The last to leave was Linnea. I want to learn everything you know, the girl said, everything your grandfather taught you, everything you figured out on your own. I want to build bridges, like you build bridges. Ingrid looked at this young woman who had defied her father to help a foolish widow, who had nearly frozen to death, bringing her family to safety, who saw something in the Gangbru that no one else had seen. Then you will, Ingrid said, and someday you will teach someone else. It was a promise that would echo through generations. The years that followed the great storm of 1893 were kind to Frost Hollow Valley. Not because the winters became gentler. They did not. The cold still came each December like a hungry wolf, and the snow still buried the valley in white silence, and the wind still howled through the mountain passes with enough force to knock a man off his feet. But the deaths stopped. In the decade before Ingrid built her passage, Frost Hollow had averaged 4 deaths per winter from exposure. People freezing between buildings, people losing their way in sudden storms, people who stepped outside for just a moment and never stepped back in. In the decade after, that number dropped to 0. 0 deaths, 0 widows made by winter, 0 children orphaned by snow. The passages made the difference. Those wooden bridges between buildings, elevated above the drifts, roofed against the snow, walled against the wind. They turned every homestead into a small fortress against the cold, connected instead of isolated, protected instead of exposed. And at the center of it all stood Ingrid Larsen, the widow who had been called a fool. Klaus Weber proposed to her in the autumn of 1894. He was a good man, the German blacksmith. He had lost his first wife to childbed fever 5 years earlier and had raised his 2 children alone ever since. He respected Ingrid's intelligence. He admired her courage. And he had spent enough time working beside her to know that his feelings ran deeper than simple admiration. He asked her on a September evening, when the aspens were turning gold and the air carried the first hint of the coming winter. They were sitting on her porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains, and he took her hand in his calloused palm. "I am not asking you to forget your husband," he said. "I would never ask that. I am only asking if there might be room in your life for a friend who wishes he could be more." Ingrid looked at him for a long time. He was kind, she knew. Strong, patient. He would make a good partner for the winters ahead. But when she closed her eyes, she still saw Gunnar's face, still felt his hand in hers, still heard his voice telling her she was stronger than she knew. "I loved my husband with everything I had," she said finally. "I do not have enough left for another marriage." But she squeezed his hand. "I could use a good friend, Klaus, and a better blacksmith." Klaus smiled, a little sadly, a little hopefully. "Then friends we shall be, and I will forge the best hinges this valley has ever seen for your passages." He kept that promise for the rest of his life. Linnea Patterson married in 1898 to a young man named Thomas Erickson, who had come from Minnesota to learn the passage building trade. He was the first of many young men and women who traveled to Frost Hollow to study under the widow Larsen, to learn the techniques that her grandfather had perfected in Norway and that she had adapted for the harsh Montana winters. Linnea did not stop building when she married. If anything, she built more. She and Thomas established a construction company that specialized in passages, traveling throughout Montana and Wyoming and the Dakotas to build connections between buildings that had stood isolated for decades. By 1910, their company had built over 300 passages. By 1920, that number had grown to over 1,000. Ingrid attended their wedding in the passage that connected her cabin to her workshop. It was an unconventional venue, but Linnea had insisted. "This is where I learned what I could become," the young woman said, looking at the walls that had sheltered 17 people through the worst storm in memory. "This is where I learned that a woman can build anything she sets her mind to." Ingrid smiled. "You learned that from your own heart. I just showed you where to start." Old Sven Lindqvist died in the winter of 1899 at the age of 78. He passed quietly in his sleep in the small cabin he had built for himself on the edge of Ingrid's property. He had spent his final years as her unofficial advisor, contributing his knowledge of Swedish construction techniques, refining details that made the passages stronger and more efficient. They found him in the morning, his face peaceful, his hands folded on his chest as if he had arranged them himself. On the table beside his bed was a note, written in the shaky handwriting of an old man whose eyes had begun to fail. "The old ways are not lost. They live in the people who remember them. Ingrid Larsen remembers. The bridge will stand." They buried him in the small cemetery beside Gunnar, in a grave that Ingrid visited every week until her own death. Odin died in the summer of 1901 at the remarkable age of 14. He had been slowing down for years, his silver muzzle going white, his steps growing careful where they had once been confident. But he had never stopped following Ingrid, never stopped pressing against her legs when she was sad, never stopped watching over her with those ancient, knowing eyes. On his last day, he walked with her through the passage one final time. He stopped in the middle, in the spot where he had always paused to look out through the slatted walls at the world beyond. He sat down, he looked at her, and then he lay down, put his head on his paws, and went to sleep. Ingrid sat beside him until the sun went down. She stroked his fur and told him stories about Gunnar, about Norway, about all the adventures they had shared. She thanked him for the years of loyalty. She thanked him for leading her to the woodpile in the storm. She thanked him for believing in her when no one else did. When she was sure he was gone, she carried him to the entrance of the passage and buried him there, in the spot where he had spent so many hours watching her work. The marker was simple, carved by Klaus Weber from a single piece of oak. Odin, he believed first. He led the way home, 1887 to 1901. The whole valley came to the burial, not because Odin was just a though he was a remarkable one, but because he represented something important. The loyalty that sustains us when logic says we should quit. The faith that someone we love is doing something meaningful even when we do not understand it. He chose you, Linnea said, standing beside Ingrid, as the first shovel of dirt fell on the grave. When you were just a lonely widow with strange ideas. He chose you. I was lucky, Ingrid said. No, Linnea shook her head. He was smart. Dogs always know. The years continued to pass, as years do, marked by winters survived and passages built, and children born and elders buried. Frost Hollow grew from a struggling settlement into a proper town, with a church and a school and a general store that no longer laughed at widows with unconventional ideas. The passage that Ingrid had built became a landmark, pointed out to visitors as the structure that had started it all. Cornelius Blackwood died in 1907 at the age of 72. He had spent the last 14 years of his life making amends for the first 58. He had funded the construction of passages for dozens of families. He had worked alongside the people he had once looked down upon. He had learned finally that safety came not from money but from community. On his deathbed, he asked to see Ingrid. She came to his bedside, this old enemy who had become something like a friend, and she held his hand while he said what he needed to say. I watched my wife and daughter die, he whispered, and I spent 20 years believing that the only way to survive was to control everything, to own everything, to need no one. He squeezed her hand. You showed me I was wrong. You showed me that the way to survive is to build bridges between buildings, between people, between enemies. We are not enemies, Cornelius. No, he smiled, the first genuine smile she had ever seen on his face. We are neighbors, and you saved my life. I spent the last years trying to be worthy of that gift. You were worthy, Ingrid said. Every day you were worthy. He died that night with her hand still in his. Dr. Franklin Mercer published a paper in 1912 in the Journal of the American Society of Civil Engineers. It was titled Vernacular Architecture and Survival, an analysis of the Larson Passage System, and it caused something of a sensation in academic circles. He had spent 15 years studying the passages, measuring their performance, analyzing their construction. His paper proved what Ingrid had known all along, that the design was not just practical, but optimal, that the principles her grandfather had developed through trial and error were mathematically superior to conventional construction, that traditional knowledge passed down through generations could be more sophisticated than anything taught in universities. The paper cited Ingrid by name, calling her one of the most important vernacular architects of the 19th century. It included photographs of her original passage, still standing, still functioning, after nearly 2 decades of Montana winters. Ingrid read the paper and laughed. They called me a fool, she said to Klaus, who had come to visit with his grandchildren. They said the physics were impossible, and now they are writing papers about me in fancy journals. Klaus smiled. The bridge answers the doubter. Is that not what you said? My grandfather said it. I just repeated it, and built it, improved it, and saved 17 lives with it. Klaus shook his head. Accept the recognition, Ingrid. You earned it. She tried. But the recognition never sat comfortably on her shoulders. She had not built the passage for recognition. She had built it for love, for Gunnar, for the dream he had drawn before he died. Every morning she still walked through the passage he had envisioned. Every morning she still touched the wall she had built with her own hands. Every morning she still whispered his name, telling him what had happened the day before, sharing the small victories and the ordinary moments that make up a life. And sometimes when the wind blew just right through the slatted walls, she could swear she heard him answer. Everything else was just snow sliding off a properly pitched roof. The final years of Ingrid's life were quiet ones. She stopped taking apprentices after her 75th birthday, though people still came from across the territory to see her original passage and to ask for advice. She spent her days reading, tending a small garden, and sitting on her porch with whatever dog had adopted her at the moment. There had been several since Odin, each one finding her as if drawn by some invisible thread. She never forgot him, though. Every spring she placed wildflowers on his grave. Every winter she told stories about him to children who visited. He saved my life, she would say. Not once, but every day. By believing in me when no one else did. By staying beside me when everyone else walked away. By leading me home when I was lost in the storm. The children would listen with wide eyes, not quite understanding, but somehow knowing that this mattered, that loyalty mattered, that belief mattered, that sometimes a dog could teach you more about love than a lifetime of human relationships. Ingrid Larson died on March 15, 1923, at the age of 80. She passed in the cabin that she and Gunnar had built together, in the bed where they had slept for 43 years of marriage, surrounded by people who loved her. Linnea was there, holding one hand. Klaus's daughter, now grown with children of her own, held the other. Through the window, they could see the passage, still standing after 30 years, still connecting cabin to workshop, still doing what it had been built to do. The last words Ingrid spoke were in Norwegian. Min elskede, my beloved, jeg kommer, I am coming. Then she closed her eyes and did not open them again. They buried her next to Gunnar in the small cemetery overlooking the valley. Over 400 people attended the funeral, traveling from across Montana and Wyoming and the Dakotas and as far away as Canada and Alaska. Families who had survived blizzards and passages she had helped them build. Children and grandchildren of the 17 people who had sheltered in her cabin during the Great Storm of 1893. Strangers who had read about her in newspapers and wanted to pay respects to a woman who had changed the way a region thought about winter. Linnea Patterson Erickson delivered the eulogy. Ingrid Larson, she said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd, was 50 years old when she started building. Her husband had just died. Her neighbors called her a fool. Her enemies tried to take her land, and she built anyway. Linnea paused, looking at the passage visible in the distance, a dark line against the spring snow. She built a bridge between her cabin and her workshop. And then she built bridges between her community and survival, between tradition and innovation, between the old ways and the new world. She built bridges between enemies who became friends, between strangers who became family, between a widow's grief and a valley's salvation. Linnea's voice broke, but she continued. The passages she taught us to build still stand. They will stand for decades more. And every time someone walks from house to barn without stepping into the killing cold, they are walking on a bridge that Ingrid Larson showed us how to build. She stepped back from the grave. Rest now, Ingrid. Gunnar is waiting, and the bridges will hold. The original passage still stands today. The cabins have been rebuilt twice, modernized with electricity and insulation, adapted to the needs of each new generation. But the elevated walkway is original. The same post that Ingrid sunk in 1893, the same floor she walked across during that first storm, the same peaked roof that shed snow while the valley buried itself in white. Visitors come sometimes to see where it happened, to stand in the passage where 17 people survived the Great Storm of 1893, to touch the wood that a 50-year-old widow cut and shaped while her neighbors called her a fool. Most leave with a new appreciation for stubbornness. Some leave with plans to build their own passages. A few leave with tears in their eyes, having recognized something in Ingrid's story that resonated with their own lives. At the entrance to the passage, 3 markers stand in a row. The first reads, Gunnar Larson, 1838 to 1892. He drew the dream. She built the bridge. The second reads, Odin, 1887 to 19. 01, he believed first. He led the way home. The third reads, Ingrid Larson, 1843 to 1923. She built bridges when others built walls. Every winter, when the storms come and the snow buries the valley and the temperature drops toward lethal, people walk through covered passages between their buildings and arrive safely at their destinations. Children go to school without fear of sudden blizzards. Families visit each other without risking their lives. The elderly check on their neighbors without gambling against the cold. No one freezes between structures that are only 30 feet apart. That was the promise Gunnar Larson drew on paper before he died. That was the promise Ingrid Larson built with her own hands at 50 years old, while her neighbors laughed and her enemies schemed and her dog watched from the porch with patient, believing eyes. That is the promise the passages keep every single day. And now our story is complete. But before you go, I want to leave you with one final thought. Ingrid Larson was not a hero in any conventional sense. She was not young, she was not strong, she did not have money or power or influence. She was just a widow who knew something that other people did not believe, and who built it anyway. The people who called her a fool were not stupid. They were experienced. They had survived winters that killed others. They had every reason to believe that their way was the right way. But Ingrid had something they did not have: knowledge from her grandfather, drawings from her husband, and a refusal to accept that the way things had always been done was the only way they could be done. Sometimes that is all it takes to save 17 lives. To change a valley, to build something that lasts for over a century. Sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to listen to the doubters. If this story touched you, please take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell me what you thought. Tell me about a time when you believed in something even when others told you it was impossible. I read every comment, and your stories mean the world to me. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, please subscribe to this channel and click the notification bell. We post new videos every week, stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And remember, the bridge answers the doubter. You will see.